Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a pretty unique product, one that I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it before, and that's the xDuoo MU-603. Now at first glance, you might look at this and think, it's pretty normal, it's an xDuoo tube amplifier, we've seen those before. But you'd actually be wrong because the MU-603 is actually a Bluetooth DAC, it's only a Bluetooth DAC, and it's a tube DAC on top of it. So it's a Bluetooth tube DAC, not something you generally see too often. The MU-603 retails for $119 US, making it a very affordable DAC and tube preamp thing, I guess. And I want to say a huge thank you to Linsol for sending me this unit for review. As I've already said, this combination is quite a strange setup, being a Bluetooth-only DAC with a tube-based preamp stage. It uses the Sabre ESS9018K2M chip, which may or may not mean anything to you, and it doesn't really matter. The point is it's using a quality-based DAC chip, not the most recent or the most high-tech, but it's also only decoding Bluetooth audio, so you don't really need the latest and greatest with DSD and all those things, because it's only going to handle Bluetooth codecs. Given that it only handles Bluetooth, it's important to know that it's running Bluetooth 5.1, meaning it's a very recent version of Bluetooth with very low latency and also full support for aptX HD. That doesn't mean it's giving you the same level of quality as a wired connection, whether it's optical, coaxial, USB, it's not at that level, but it's still giving you a fairly good transmission option. Added to the mix here, as you can see and as we've already alluded to, is a tube sticking out the top. xDuoo have chosen to use a 12AU7 tube, which is great because they're abundantly available, and I will provide one quick example later of a different tube in the xDuoo so you can get a sense of what tube rolling might do. Speaking of tubes, you might have noticed we've got some new merch on the store. This is the Tubes t-shirt. It comes in a white or a black. So if you're in the market for a t-shirt, a hoodie, a cap, any of those sorts of things, check out the link down below to see what new merch I've got on the store. For now though, let's take a tour of the MU-603. The front panel is incredibly simple. We've got an on-off switch and a couple of lights. One light tells you when the amplifier is on and it flashes until it's warmed up, which only takes a few seconds. And then next to that, we've got the HD light, which tells you if you're running aptX HD. So if you're using a lower quality codec, that light won't turn on, and it gives you a good way of understanding what you're actually sending in terms of quality. Finally, there's a little red button here, which is purely for pairing mode. It just allows you to put the MU-603 into such a state that you can then pair it up with whatever device you're sending an audio from. And that's all there is to it. For most people, you're going to pair it once, and that's it. You're then just going to switch on your amp, go to whatever device is feeding and is previously paired with the MU-603 and play your music. Going to the back of the device, things are almost as simple. We've got a power input for an inline style switch mode power supply, meaning that it's got a normal plug to the wall, a lead into a box, a bit like a laptop often uses, and then another lead coming from that into the MU-603. Above the power supply is our Bluetooth antenna, and then there's actually two sets of RCA outputs, and this kind of surprised me. It's nice that they've done it. I don't see how many times you're likely to connect this up to multiple different outputs. Maybe if you're running a pair of active speakers from one and a headphone amplifier from the other perhaps, but I don't see many situations where I'd be running multiple different amps from a device like this. Still, it's nice to have the flexibility, so that's there if you want it. Because things are so simple though, let's jump straight into sound quality. And the sound from the 603 is very smooth and rich and organic. It's got a great sense of mid-range clarity. And although some of the things I'm describing some people might think are tube sound, what I'd say is that until you put it in a comparison with another product, it doesn't sound overly tubey. And what I mean by that is it doesn't sound like some people think of tubes as being, that being overly thick and rich and warm. It's definitely a smooth sounding DAC. It's definitely a mid-range focus type DAC using the stock tube, but it's not some thick, rich, muddy beast. And I know I've said this lots of times before, but in case you haven't seen my other reviews, tubes aren't necessarily rich and thick and muddy. There are some very analytical tubes out there, there are some very thick and muddy tubes out there, and there's everything in between. What xDuoo have chosen to ship the MU-603 with is probably something that errs slightly richer than neutral, but it's not overdone in any way. It just makes for an enjoyable, slightly mid-range focused DAC. I will of course provide a comparison shortly so you can hear how it compares to a solid-state DAC, but for now, just keeping this in isolation, the other things I noticed was that the MU-603 has a wonderful sense of bass from it. It's got this beautiful sense of depth and presence in the bass. It's not bloated or slow or over enhanced or anything, but there's a great sense of depth and presence to the bass that kind of surprised me a little bit. The staging from the 603 is fairly compact. Sometimes tubes can bring a greater sense of space in the sound, but that's not the case in the MU-603. It's quite a compact sound in terms of the soundstage, with mid-range and vocals quite forward in the mix and quite close to the listener. Listening on headphones, the whole soundstage will stay inside your head when using the MU-603. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's worth being aware of if you particularly value a large, spacious soundstage. This isn't going to be the DAC for you, but what it does present is nice enough. As I said, the mid-range is a bit forward, and I mean that mostly in a spatial sense. It is a slightly mid-forward DAC tonally as well, but in this moment I'm talking about the spatial characteristics. And what I mean is that within that kind of inside your head soundstage, there's a bit of a conical shape to it where the vocals, the mid-range is a bit closer to you, and everything spreads out a little bit from there. Having said that, there's not a huge amount of depth, so it's a fairly subtle distinction that I'm making here. I felt like the separation of sounds, so in other words, the ability to put a guitar here and a vocalist here and something else here, that's quite good for a Bluetooth device in my opinion, but at the same time it's not going to stack up to a wide connection device. Ultimately, what I was hearing from the MU-603 was an enjoyable and engaging sound. It doesn't set the world on fire because it's Bluetooth and it's tubes, so when they're combined into a DAC, you're making sacrifices along the way, but that might be just what you need if you've got a system that's a bit cool or analytical, maybe pairing it up with a small pair of studio monitors or other active speakers, and you want to deliberately bring a little bit of warmth and a little bit of soul. That's where the MU-603 could be absolutely great. And so in isolation, if you need a Bluetooth only DAC, then I do think the MU-603 could be quite a lot of fun. But having said that, I was keen to see what some competition might look like if we were to spend roughly the same ballpark money, not exactly, but close to it, on a solid-state wired DAC. Now I say a solid-state wired DAC, but for this comparison I've kept everything Bluetooth related, and let me explain what I mean. So I've got coming up very soon the SMSL SU-6 and SH-6 very budget, very compact stack. And so if you want to see that one, do make sure you hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. But for this comparison, what I did was just grab the SU-6, which is the DAC, and I fired that up to compare it directly with the MU-603. The SU-6 from SMSL retails for $50 more than the 603, but for that money you're getting a fully wired DAC that also happens to have Bluetooth and also happens to have LDAC. LDAC is a Bluetooth codec which is a little bit better than aptX HD in my experience, maybe not quite as stable, so your transmission distances might be reduced, the ability to go through walls and things like that might be a bit reduced, but pure sound quality, if you've got a direct line of sight and things are within range, LDAC will often slightly pip what aptX HD can do in terms of pure sound quality. And so my comparison here was to say, if you've decided to spend that little bit more to get a fully wired DAC, is it worth getting a Bluetooth DAC as well, like the MU-603, or does using the Bluetooth function of the SU-6 provide equal or better sound quality? And so for this test, I fired both up. I was using aptX HD to the MU-603, being its best quality codec, and I was using LDAC to the SU-6, being its best quality codec. One of the tracks I listened to for this test was Air Forces by Mustafa, and what I heard was that the SU-6 as a Bluetooth DAC sounds absolutely great. For this test, I was feeding both DACs into the SMSL SH-6, which I'm not going to talk about here, that's for a separate review, but that was my amp with both of these DACs, and it was driving the Hi-Fi Aria Stealth Magnet version. The sound from the SU-6, even running as a Bluetooth only DAC, was excellent. It was clean, it was detailed, it was smooth, thoroughly enjoyable. I felt there was a nice balance of bass and mids and treble. Everything was tonally very neutral, very natural. Flicking over to the MU-603, and things did get noticeably a little bit thicker, a little bit warmer. They didn't get super thick, but it wasn't quite as clean and detailed as I heard from the SU-6. And the SU-6 managed to stay very enjoyable, so it didn't get dry or grainy. So in that sense, that's where I say the MU-603 shows a bit of its tubiness, it shows a bit of its warmth and its little bit of mid-range focus when you do start to compare it. But it's not massively thick and massively rich. What the MU-603 does though, is it makes the vocals just that little bit richer, that little bit more focused in the mix. Details from this track were still well defined for the MU-603, so it wasn't like it became this sludgy monster where you couldn't pick out the micro details. It was all still there in general, but it wasn't quite as overall resolved as you hear from the SU-6. The SU-6 just had a touch of crispness, if you like, that the MU-603 didn't, but both of them were very, very good listens. One area that I definitely noticed for me, what I felt was a benefit from the MU-603, was that bass presence I mentioned before. The bass was just a little bit fuller, it had a nice sense of punch and drive to it coming from the MU-603. Again, it didn't get slow or flabby or bloated, but there was just a bit more presence and a bit more punch. That could be either better or worse depending on your tastes, your headphones, your amplifier, etc. But I really liked that about the MU-603 sound. So for me, by this point, I was feeling like the MU-603 is a perfect addition to a system like, as I said before, a small pair of active bookshelves or monitors where you want that extra bit of warmth and body and punch. It's not quite as resolving or neutral as something like the SU-6, but at its price and with its very focused feature set, I do think it's a fun choice for that sort of system. Before I wrap things up though, let me give you one tube rolling example, and I've deliberately chosen a new production tube as a quick tube rolling example just to show you what you could achieve with the MU-603 without having to go to the trouble of hunting down expensive or hard to get tubes. The tube that I rolled in here was a Genalex Gold Lion 12AU7 tube, so these are readily available, they cost about half as much as the DAC, but having said that, they're also kind of the engine room of the output stage, so it's a worthwhile investment in my opinion. What I heard when I swapped the Gold Lion in was the tonality didn't change a great deal from the stock tube, but what it did do was bring a greater sense of clarity. So what I mean by that is imagine the tonality stays the same, but the clarity's just dialed up a little bit. So all the sounds are a bit better defined, a bit better focused. There's maybe a little bit more air and texture in the top end of things, so maybe the treble's lifted a tiny bit, but more at the upper end. I don't think it's a significant frequency response shift. I don't think it's anything that would show up significantly if you did a frequency sweep with a pair of headphones or speakers, but it's just enough to give you a greater sense of clarity and texture in the sound. What it also did was provide a wider and more open soundstage by just a small amount. I didn't feel like the soundstage now extended outside the head, but it just made everything feel a little bit more separated, just a little bit more defined in space. So even with the higher quality tube, I don't feel like it matched the clarity and the precision of the SU-6, but what it did do was maximize everything that I like about the MU-603. It retained that sense of smoothness and that kind of organic, ever so slightly rich sound. The bass presence and the fullness stayed there, but it just sharpened up the clarity a little bit. And so if you're in the market for a niche product like this, that being a Bluetooth Tube DAC, then I think the MU-603 could be really good. I don't see a lot of use cases for it outside of driving something like a pair of active speakers, but maybe you want a Bluetooth headphone setup with a simple amplifier, you want a bit of that warmth and richness and punch that I've described from the MU-603, and you don't want it wired to a source device. In that case, this could be fantastic. So if that's of interest to you and you like the sound of the MU-603, I'll put a link down below through to Linsol. It's a way of saying thank you to them for sending me the product. It is an affiliate link. I will get some small kickbacks from any sales made, but as always, that doesn't influence my overall opinions on these products. In fact, I'd go so far as saying that if you're in the market for an outstanding Bluetooth and wired DAC for just a little bit more, then do stay tuned for the SU-6 and SH-6 stack review. For that little bit more money, I do think the SU-6 is the better product because it's so much more versatile and still an outstanding Bluetooth DAC. So stay tuned for that one, but don't ignore the MU-603 because maybe you don't need to spend the extra money. Maybe you don't need a DSD wired XYZ does everything DAC. Maybe you just want a simple, warm, engaging, enjoyable DAC that's going to be used Bluetooth only with a pair of speakers or a headphone amp. If that's the case, check out the link through to Linsol, grab one for yourself. It's a beautiful little product. As always, if you found this review useful, I'd love it if you'd hit the subscribe button, the like button, and ring the notification bell. It helps to tell me and YouTube that you want to see more videos like this one. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.